The more that you want, the harder it is to feel wealthy, even if you technically have a lot, because the gap between what you have and what you expect and want just keeps getting wider. And that is what kills contentment. Honey, you should see my book. I had to annotate because I was drawing arrows trying to figure out like how the concepts were connected. Welcome to the Rich and Regular Podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Kirsten, and today is a solo episode because today we're talking about a book I just read called The Art of Spending Money by Morgan Housel. And today I'm going to give you a little book review and talk about my takeaways. But first, I want to give a shout out to everybody who, I was going to make this specific, but I'm just going to go broad. I want to give a shout out to everybody who sent a note or a DM, an email, a text message, a WhatsApp, everybody who was just so encouraging about the last solo episode I did on ADHD. It is your fault, or perhaps your influence, that has led me to do another episode today by myself, because I would like to get used to talking to the camera, talking to y'all without you being in front of me. And the only way I do that is to get rips. And the reason I want to get used to it is because there are things that I do that Julian does not do, but I still want to talk about it. Like, I read this book. He did not read the book. I don't know if he would have enjoyed it, but he probably would have enjoyed the conversation, but I can't wait for him to read the book before I start the conversation. So that's why we're doing today's episode. And I'm excited to share what I learned. All right. So Morgan Housel, if you're not familiar with who Morgan Housel is, he's one of those finance writers that has like a cult following, not like a YouTube-y, like I have a million followers cult following, but like a Clark Howard, if you know cult following. Like, he is the kind of author that you see on somebody's nightstand or coffee table or reading in public, doing performative reading, whatever they call it, when they are ready to get serious about money. He is a former journalist, like his background is in journalism. He used to write for, I believe, The Motley Fool, like one of those publications. And his essays are known for being like really, really accessible. Like, they are essays that don't sound like financial advice at all. Like, you'll get 3 paragraphs in and realize that it's about money. So he's just a really interesting writer. Like, he uses ordinary observations to make really insightful points about a financial concept or term. And, you know, it's not always profound. It's just really honest and really simple. If you have heard of him, you've probably heard of him because of his most popular book, which is called The Psychology of Money, which has sold millions and millions of copies, like 4 million copies, which, when you think about the idea that people don't like to talk about money, or the claim that people don't think about money, selling 4 million financial books is like a hell of a feat. So he's a great writer. He's even better at selling books. So the book, The Psychology of Money, is basically a longer version of what people say about personal finance all the time. That is 80% behavior and only like 20% knowledge or expertise or terminology, or, you know, knowing what accounts to put things in. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because it's important that you know that Morgan is one of the few finance writers who has built his career on not giving formulas or telling people explicitly what to do or what not to do. He is really interested in the stories that we tell ourselves and how those stories shape the decisions that we make with our money. And so the way that he writes his book is full of like short chapters, anecdotes, stories, all these things that to some people make it very appealing. It's almost like somebody's talking to you at the dinner table. But on the other hand, his writing, because it is so accessible, it's almost too accessible. And so he has gotten some critique on his writing style and the popularity of his message, depending on who you ask. You know, as someone who has written a book, I'm always very conscious of critical feedback on an author and their writing style and what they're trying to accomplish within the constraints of a book. But I do think that there are some critiques of his writing that are valid. I think they're right about a couple of things. One of the common critiques is that his ideas aren't always so deep, that, you know, the book specifically the psychology of money, circles around human behavior without ever really pressing into why people behave that way or how that behavior changes based on your background or your identity or your access to resources. These are all things that are going to impact your behavior. But he kind of talks about human behavior as if it's a universal, even though he's making disclaimers that we're all different. The other fair critique on the psychology of money is about the scope of the book. For a book that has the word psychology in it, it doesn't really get into the structural stuff. It doesn't really get into the systems that shape our financial choices and thinking. So again, I understand why in the constraints of a book, you would not do that, but it doesn't, it's not going to get into that. I think the last critique that I would agree about the psychology of money is that it is a book about money for people who already have money. It's very values driven. It very much assumes that you are not already living paycheck to paycheck or struggling with money because they're talking about the psychology of money that you already have, which brings me to this new book. I know that was a long buildup, but I had to give you the context because it's important that you hear my feedback and my takeaways from this new book, knowing how I feel about Morgan, who I'm a fan of, by the way. I'm a fan of his writing and his work. So this new book, The Art of Spending Money, I think it came out in October of 2025. And the title in and of itself is a great title. In theory, this is a universal idea. We are all spending money. But once you get into the book, you realize this isn't really a book about paying bills or handling debt or making hard trade-offs. This is a book about discretionary spending. If I were to name this book, it would be The Art of Discretionary Spending, which I know ain't gonna do no numbers. But this is a book about how to spend the money after you've already covered your basic needs. It's how to spend whatever's left. This is a book for people with options. It's about how to spend money well, not how to survive when you don't have enough of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is still a very thoughtful and very honest book. But it's important to name it because if you are in a season where spending feels very hard to do, this book probably isn't going to land with you. It's going to feel a little soft. And if you're in a season where you have some breathing room, then this might be the perfect time to re-examine where that extra money is going and how you're using it. Now, if you are in that first camp of people who don't have any extra money, that doesn't mean you have to stop listening to the episode. There's still going to be something in here for you, I would hope. So let's get into it. I have two big takeaways from this book. I read the whole thing. Typically, I will read the first 60 pages of a book before I decide if I'm going to finish it. And with this one, the first 60 pages were really good. After that, it got a little slow for me. And then I liked the way that it ended. So actually, the two takeaways are from the beginning of the book. He opens with this reminder that every behavior makes sense with enough information. And we talk about context all the time on this podcast, but he takes it a little further and kind of uses it to describe the tension behind so many arguments about money, what people should be doing with their money, what people shouldn't spend their money on. And he says that those disagreements or arguments are really just people with wildly different life experiences talking past each other. Because if you had enough information, then it would make more sense. Some people grew up around scarcity. Some people grew up around abundance. And all of that shapes the way that we spend, even if we don't realize it. What feels like a bad decision from the outside might be a survival strategy for someone who is in it. And what feels like a guilty pleasure or waste of money to one person might be someone else's non-negotiable source of joy. His point was that every behavior is going to make sense with enough information. And usually when something don't make sense to you is because you don't have enough information, which is great. We talk about something similar in our book and we remind people to stay curious. But I bring that up because if you are coming to this book or even this episode hoping to hear a list of correct ways to spend money or to prove somebody wrong about their choices, this ain't that. And honestly, it shouldn't be, because as much as most personal finance advice likes to assume that there's this universal standard of what's smart, what's wasteful, what's responsible, that logic only works if you're assuming that we are starting from the same place, which we don't. We never have as a people, as a species. And I think that reminder that all spending makes sense with enough information was timely for me because of the season that we're in and because of just where I am with my own life personally. This is the time of year where spending just gets really, really loud It's the holidays. There are all these expectations about what a proper Christmas is, what the appropriate amount of celebrating and splurging is. And it can get really confusing if you're trying to stick to a budget or if you're trying to build a different tradition within your family. I think one of the reasons that this is top of mind for me is that Bo actually gets 2 Christmases. He gets one at our house and then he gets one at my parents' house. And there were several years where Julian would look around and see all of the gifts that he got here. And then, he gets the second round of gifts at my parents' house and basically second Christmas. And Julian would wonder, like, are we doing too much? Like, why? Why is all of this necessary? And I get it. From the outside, it probably does look like a lot. And I understand the concerns about raising a kid who is spoiled or ungrateful and is just overwhelmed by all of the excess and just holding the idea that this is a tradition that may not last forever. Like this may not even be a sustainable tradition. So why start it? But I had to explain it to him and giving him the information that my mom is one of 9 kids. She did not grow up with abundance. And so for her, the second Christmas for her grandkids is not about excess or even gift giving. It's about making sure that everybody feels seen. And I think once Julian got that this wasn't about a flex, this wasn't about spoiling the kids, this wasn't about just excess for excess sake, he didn't really fight it anymore or even, he was never fighting it, but like he wasn't concerned about it as much anymore. And he just kind of adjusted and actually started to participate like, okay, well, can you at least tell her no more socks? Or can you at least make sure that she knows that this is the thing that he actually wants? Her behavior didn't change, but his interpretation of it did once the information came through. And I think that's the key. Like if you are noticing someone spending in a way that feels over the top or confusing, or even if you're judging your own spending behaviors, try asking yourself, what story is this behavior trying to tell? I think that was an important takeaway, even if it wasn't a new one for me. Sometimes books will refresh a message that I need to hear that has been tucked away in the back of my mind and treated as common knowledge, but needs a little extra seasoning because of the timing that we're in or the situation that we're going through at home. So that's the first takeaway. All behavior makes sense with enough information. The next big takeaway from the book was about happiness. And happiness is a topic that I have been digging deep into both in conversation and on my own for a little creative project that I'm working on that I may be ready to talk about soon. But I've been talking about happiness a lot. And so I was curious about how a guy who leans on simple sentences and clean logic approached something as subjective and personal as happiness. And what I found was that we actually agree eventually. Like we get there eventually. So let me start with the way that I think about happiness, which I think about happiness as a mood state that is relative to your own emotional baseline. It is something that fluctuates like hunger, which means that there's no external reference point required. You're not looking at somebody else to figure out if you're hungry. You either feel it or you don't, based on what's inside of you. I think that's how happiness works. Now, he thinks about it a little differently. He says, and I quote, all happiness is just the gap between expectations and reality. So it's not the size of the win. It's not how fancy the experience was. It's just the gap between your expectations and reality. And he gives this example of the best drink that you'll ever have. He says that the best drink that you'll ever have in life is a glass of tap water when you're thirsty. And it's not because the tap water is luxurious, but because of the contrast between what your body needed and what it just received. That is what creates the feeling, that shift from less to more, or from discomfort to relief, or from hoping to having. It's not the thing itself. It's the difference that it made. And when I think about the way that he defines it and the way that I define it, the key difference is the reference point. Mine is internal. It's how I feel compared to how I felt 5 minutes ago. And his is external. It's how this moment stacks up against what I expected. And I like that framing. Like when I sat with it for a little bit, I like the framing. It's the kind of clean model that he is known for, but it also assumes that you either have expectations or the privilege of adjusting your expectations based on any situation. It also assumes that you have some level of control over your outcomes. And it assumes that you have the emotional space to evaluate this gap that exists between what you wanted and what you got. To me, those three things are a little bit of a psychological luxury that doesn't invalidate his view. Like, I'm not taking away from the view. Like I said, I like the model, but it explains why we come into the conversation through different front doors when we're talking about something like happiness. Because I can use his framing in some places in my life where I do feel like, okay, yeah, I have the control over my outcomes. I do have the ability to adjust my expectations. I do have the ability to evaluate whether or not this met them or fell short, but it's not in every place of my life. It's in some places, but not others. It is in my discretionary spending. And I think if we can just keep it there, like, am I happy with what I spent my money on? This can be a really useful way to evaluate, because when I look at happiness that way as this moving comparison point, it changes how I think about spending money, because it reinforces that more isn't always better and newer isn't always more exciting. Because we've talked about this on the podcast. Basically, what he's saying is the more that we raise our expectations, the harder it gets to feel that contrast. We get used to the upgrade and then we adjust. And now we're just chasing something else to try to feel the same thing again. And so if happiness, again, related to discretionary spending, is about that contrast, then he says that contentment is about holding on to your ability to feel the contrast. So it is keeping things steady so that when you are encountering something better, you can actually feel the contrast. You're not numb to it. And this is where he makes another point that I really appreciate. He says that the best measure of wealth is what you have minus what you want. So in other words, the more that you want, the harder it is to feel wealthy, even if you technically have a lot, because the gap between what you have and what you expect and want just keeps getting wider. And that is what kills contentment. Honey, you should see my book. I had to annotate because I was drawing arrows trying to figure out like how the concepts were connected. But you have these two ideas, contrast and contentment, and they actually work together really nicely. Contrast is the thing that is explaining how happiness happens, that feeling that comes from the difference or the gap. And then contentment is what makes that feeling sustainable. It is what keeps your expectations from rising so fast that nothing ever feels good anymore. And when you look at it that way, like when you really look at it that way, you realize that a lot of spending isn't about buying joy. It's about chasing that contrast that we can no longer feel because we've trained ourselves to always expect more and better. And we're part of a system that is always raising the bar and expecting more from us. So the question becomes, how do you keep your expectations in check long enough to actually be satisfied with what you already have? That's the question to me. Like, I understand the relationship between contrast and contentment, but the question I'm left with is like, all right, well, then how do I keep my expectations in check? And Morgan doesn't really answer that. And I didn't expect him to, because he can't. He says things like, so much about a good life is what didn't happen. And he offers some guardrails like minimizing future regret and avoiding letting money control you, and don't confuse status with utility. But I felt like the rest of the book was really about what not to do, which is lie to yourself. Because we already said it, the more that we raise our expectations, the harder it gets to feel that contrast. So if the trap is by the time you get what you wanted, you've already moved the goalposts, then the only way out is to realize and notice when you're doing it, and then to ask yourself, how much money am I going to spend chasing my own tail? And if you're willing to ask yourself that, then you will enjoy the book. Like, that's where I landed with it. I think this is a book that is best for people who are already willing to examine themselves and not just their spending habits, like really looking inside to see, why am I doing that? So if you're in a place where you're already reflecting, you're already asking better questions, it might give you some new language or at least some new ways to think about it. But if you're hoping that it's going to help you win an argument or change somebody's mind, you're probably going to be frustrated. I would give this book a solid 7 out of 10. Like, this, what, 3.5 stars? It's good, but it's not life-changing. There's value here. There's some moments that hit, but it's not something I would hand to everybody I know, not because it's wrong, but because it leaves out some things that I think really matter, like the rising cost of staying alive. Housing, groceries, childcare, transportation. It's almost like in his mind that spending doesn't count because it's not optional enough to be interesting. And I'm not saying this as if he doesn't know that those things count as spending. I'm just saying within the context of a book, there's not enough room to say the obvious, like that That's just how editing works. And so it's not in there. But for what it is, like a well-written book about the optional stuff, it's worth a read, especially if you're in a season where you are spending more than usual and you're trying to figure out what's actually adding value and what's just a habit. It's a solid read, like really short chapters, easy to flip through, nice minimalist cover. Just know that it's not going to help you make peace with your grocery bill or any other bill that is out of control right now. All right, that's the book. And that is the book review. This went longer than I thought it would. Hopefully the next one will be a little shorter, but also hopefully you didn't mind. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular Podcast. If you like what you heard, let us know. Leave us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform or drop a comment below to keep the conversation going. We will see ya next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.